George Smith IV was living his dream. 26 years old, newly married, and sailing on his honeymoon aboard the Brilliance of the Seas in July 2005. The young man from Greenwich, Connecticut, had everything to live for. But on the night of July 5th, something went terribly wrong. Jennifer last saw her husband at 4 a.m. on their cabin balcony. By morning, George was gone. The search revealed bloodstains on their bed, a disturbing video of young men mocking George's death, and witness accounts of a horrific thud in the night. The FBI investigated for a decade before closing the case, citing insufficient evidence. Yet Jennifer never stopped believing her husband was murdered. The group of men seen with George that night remained under suspicion. Years later, new evidence would emerge. But after all this time, after all the pain and unanswered questions, one mystery still haunts everyone who knew this case. What really happened to George Smith IV that night? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The summer breeze carried the scent of salt water and new beginnings as George Smith IV stood on the deck of the Brilliance of the Seas, his arm wrapped around his bride, Jennifer's waist, pulling her close as they watched the Connecticut coastline fade into the horizon. At 26, George had everything a man could want: a successful career, a loving family back in Greenwich, and now a beautiful wife to share his life with. Their wedding photo sat prominently on the dresser of their honeymoon suite, a symbol of hope and new beginnings that would soon be shattered. In the image, George's smile was radiant, his eyes bright with the promise of forever. Jennifer looked stunning in her white gown, her face glowing with happiness as she gazed adoringly at her new husband. "Can you believe we're actually doing this?" Jennifer whispered, her voice barely audible over the ship's engines. The July sun painted golden streaks across the water, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. George squeezed her hand, his wedding ring catching the light. "Mrs. Smith," he said with a grin that had charmed her from their first meeting. "I love the sound of that." Their honeymoon suite was everything they had dreamed of. A private balcony overlooking the endless ocean, crisp white linens, and champagne chilling in an ice bucket. George had insisted on the best. He wanted their first days as husband and wife to be magical. He wanted Jennifer to feel like a princess. George had always been generous, sometimes to a fault. His friends from college would often joke that he could never pass a homeless person without giving them money, never see someone struggling without offering help. It was one of the qualities Jennifer loved most about him: his genuine compassion for others, his inability to turn away from someone in need. That first evening, they dined in the ship's finest restaurant. George was animated, his eyes bright with excitement as he talked about their future. He spoke of the children they would have, the house they would buy in Greenwich near his parents, the adventures they would share. Jennifer listened, captivated by his enthusiasm, by the way he made everything seem possible. "I want to take you to Europe next year," George said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Paris in the spring, Rome in the summer. We'll rent a little villa in Tuscany and drink wine and pretend we're in a movie." "That sounds perfect," Jennifer replied, feeling overwhelmed by the depth of her love for this man who planned their entire future in one breath. "To us," George raised his champagne glass, his voice warm with emotion, "to the beginning of our greatest adventure." "To us," Jennifer echoed, clinking her glass against his. The crystal rang like a small bell, pure and clear in the evening air. They strolled the ship's promenade hand in hand, stopping to watch other couples, families with young children, elderly pairs who had been together for decades. George squeezed Jennifer's hand tighter. This would be them someday, he thought, growing old together, still holding hands, still in love. "Promise me something," he said suddenly, stopping beside the railing that overlooked the dark ocean below. "Anything," Jennifer replied, turning to face him. "Promise me that no matter what happens, we'll always have this moment, this feeling." Jennifer smiled, touching his cheek gently. "I promise." But promises, Jennifer would later learn, are fragile things. They can be broken by forces beyond our control, shattered by events we never see coming. The next day brought more sunshine and laughter. George was in his element, making friends with other passengers, charming the ship's staff, turning their honeymoon into a celebration that seemed to include everyone around them. He had always been like that, Jennifer reflected. Magnetic. People were drawn to his warmth, his genuine interest in their stories. At the pool, George struck up conversations with other honeymooners, sharing stories of their wedding and asking about theirs. He helped an elderly woman find her lost reading glasses, played catch with a young boy whose parents were napping, and complimented the pool staff on their excellent service. "He's quite something, your husband," said Margaret, a woman in her 60s who was celebrating her 40th wedding anniversary with her husband Harold. "You can tell he's got a good heart," Jennifer beamed with pride. "He really does. Sometimes I think he loves everyone he meets." That evening, they found themselves at one of the ship's bars with a group of young men who had attached themselves to George during the day. Jennifer felt slightly uncomfortable with the group's rowdy behavior, but George seemed to be having fun. He was always inclusive, never wanting to hurt anyone's feelings by leaving them out. The group consisted of 4 men, all around George's age, all from wealthy families taking a vacation together. There was Josh, loud and boisterous, who seemed to be the leader. Ryan, quieter but with a mean streak that showed when he'd been drinking. Michael, who followed the others but seemed uncomfortable with their more aggressive behavior. And Travis Vader, who watched everything with calculating eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. Jennifer noticed how they looked at the female passengers, making crude comments when they thought no one was listening. She saw how they treated the ship's staff, snapping their fingers for service and leaving messes for others to clean up. Everything about them made her uncomfortable, but George seemed oblivious to their rudeness. "Come on, George, let's go back to the room," Jennifer suggested as the night wore on and the group grew louder, more boisterous. "Just one more drink," George said, clearly enjoying himself. "These guys have some great stories about their college days." Jennifer excused herself, feeling tired and wanting to return to their cabin. George said he would join her soon. Just wanted to finish his drink with the guys. "Don't be too long," she said, kissing him goodnight. "I won't," he promised. "Just give me a few minutes." Jennifer returned to their cabin and changed into her nightgown. She tried to wait up for George, but exhaustion overcame her. The last thing she remembered was the sound of laughter echoing down the hallway outside their door, harsh and cruel, nothing like George's warm, genuine laugh. She woke sometime around 4 a.m. to find George standing on their balcony, silhouetted against the starlit sky. The balcony railing would later become the last place he was seen alive, a piece of evidence that would haunt the investigation. He was alone, gripping the metal barrier and staring out at the dark water below. Something about his posture seemed off, but Jennifer was still half asleep. "George," she called softly. "Come to bed." He turned toward her, but the shadows made it difficult to see his face clearly. "In a minute," he said, his voice strange, distant, different somehow, as if he was struggling with something. Jennifer closed her eyes, intending to wait for him, but sleep claimed her again, and when she woke the next morning, George was gone. At first, she wasn't worried. Maybe he had gone for breakfast, or to the gym. George was an early riser, always full of energy, but as the minutes ticked by and he didn't return, a cold dread began to settle in her stomach. His running shoes were still in the closet, his toiletries untouched, the bed beside her was empty and cold. She searched the ship's restaurants, the pools, the deck areas where they had walked the night before. No one had seen him. Panic rising in her throat, Jennifer ran back to their cabin and called the front desk. "My husband is missing," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't find him anywhere." The ship's emergency horn pierced the morning air, a sound that would haunt Jennifer for the rest of her life. The piercing blast echoed across the water, transforming a peaceful morning into a nightmare. Passengers and crew members scrambled across the decks, their vacation suddenly transformed into a nightmare search and rescue operation. Captain Roberto Mendez, a veteran of 30 years at sea, had never had a passenger disappear under such mysterious circumstances. He immediately ordered a full ship search, hoping against hope that George had simply gotten lost or fallen asleep somewhere unexpected. "This is not a drill," came the announcement over the ship's intercom system. "All passengers and crew are asked to assist in the search for George Smith IV, last seen wearing a white t-shirt and khaki shorts. If you have any information regarding Mr. Smith's whereabouts, please contact ship security immediately." Jennifer stood on the deck, wrapped in a ship's blanket, watching as crew members systematically searched every inch of the Persist vessel. Her family back home had been notified. George's parents were flying to meet the ship at its next port. But with each passing hour, hope seemed to slip away like sand through her fingers. George's mother, Maureen Smith, received the call at 6 a.m. from Jennifer's trembling voice. "Something's happened to George." Jennifer sobbed into the phone. "He's missing. They can't find him anywhere." The words hit Maureen like a physical blow. Her only son, her pride and joy, the boy who had called her every Sunday without fail since leaving for college, was gone. She immediately called her husband at his office, and within hours they were on a plane to Turkey, where the ship would dock. "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions," said David Morrison, the ship's security officer, a kind man with gentle eyes who looked as shaken as Jennifer felt. Morrison had been working cruise ships for 15 years and had seen everything from petty theft to medical emergencies, but a missing passenger case of this magnitude was unprecedented. They returned to the cabin, and that's when Jennifer saw something that made her legs give way. Dark stains on the white bed sheets, stains that looked suspiciously like blood. The pristine linens that had been changed just the day before were now marked with something sinister and unexplainable. "What is that?" she whispered, pointing with a trembling hand. Morrison's face grew grave as he examined the stains more closely. He had seen enough to know that these weren't wine spills or innocent accidents. "Ma'am, I think we need to contact the FBI." The next few hours passed in a blur of investigators, crime scene photographers, and endless questions. The cabin was sealed off with yellow tape. Jennifer was moved to a different room, treated kindly but kept under careful watch. The crime scene team worked methodically, photographing every inch of the room, collecting samples, dusting for fingerprints. FBI agent Sarah Martinez arrived by helicopter, her team efficiently taking over the investigation. She was a seasoned professional who had worked dozens of cases at sea, but something about this one felt different from the start. The blood evidence, the mysterious circumstances, the complete disappearance of a healthy young man, none of it fit the pattern of a typical overboard accident. Agent Martinez was known for her methodical approach to investigations. She had joined the FBI 15 years earlier after a career as a police detective in Miami, specializing in maritime crimes. She had seen drunk passengers fall overboard, suicide cases, and even the occasional homicide, but George Smith's case would prove to be unlike anything in her experience. "Mrs. Smith," Agent Martinez said gently, sitting across from Jennifer in the ship's security office, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about last night. Every detail, no matter how small." Jennifer recounted the evening step by step. The dinner, the walk on the promenade, the group of young men at the bar. She described George's mood, his excitement about their future, his promise to return to the cabin soon. She told the agent about waking to find him on the balcony, the strange tone in his voice, the way he seemed distant and troubled. "Did your husband have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt him?" Agent Martinez asked, taking careful notes. "No," Jennifer said firmly. "Everyone loved George. He was the kindest person I knew. He went out of his way to help people, sometimes to his own detriment. His biggest flaw was trusting everyone he met." But as the investigation progressed, a different picture began to emerge. Passengers came forward with disturbing testimonies that painted the previous night in a much darker light than Jennifer had experienced. Harold and Margaret, the elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, reported hearing loud noises around 4 a.m. coming from the direction of George and Jennifer's cabin. "It sounded like furniture being moved around violently," Harold told investigators. "Then we heard what can only be described as a horrific thud, like something heavy hitting the deck. We thought about calling security," Margaret added. "But Harold said it was probably just young people being rowdy. We never imagined." An elderly woman named Dorothy Chen, who suffered from insomnia and often walked the decks early in the morning, claimed she saw one of the young men from the bar group disposing of something in a trash bin around 5 a.m. "He kept looking around, acting nervous," she told Agent Martinez. "When he saw me watching, he quickly walked away. I thought it was strange behavior for someone just throwing away garbage." The ship's janitorial staff confirmed that the trash bins in that area had been emptied and the contents were no longer available for examination, a fact that frustrated investigators but was standard procedure for the cruise line. Then came the discovery that would change everything. Hidden in Travis Vader's cabin, investigators found a digital camera containing video recordings from the previous night. The footage showed several members of the group, clearly intoxicated, making jokes about George's disappearance. Their laughter was cold, callous, showing no concern for a missing human being. "Look what happened to George," Travis said in the video, grinning at the camera. "Hope he can swim." The other men laughed uproariously, as if the potential death of someone they had been drinking with just hours earlier was the funniest thing in the world. Josh chimed in, "Maybe he went for a midnight swim and forgot he wasn't Michael Phelps." More laughter followed, the kind of cruel amusement that suggested these men knew more about George's fate than they were admitting. Jennifer watched the video in Agent Martinez's presence, her face growing pale as she witnessed the callous attitude of people George had considered new friends. Her heart broke as she realized these were the last people to see her husband alive, people he had spent his final evening with, people who showed absolutely no remorse about his disappearance. "How can they joke about this?" Jennifer whispered, tears streaming down her face. "George trusted them. He bought them drinks. He treated them like friends." Agent Martinez paused the video, her own disgust evident. She had seen callous behavior before, but this level of indifference to human suffering was particularly disturbing. "Mrs. Smith, I promise you we're going to get to the bottom of this. These men clearly know more than they're telling us." But the investigation was about to take an even darker turn. An 18-year-old female passenger named Sarah Collins came forward with allegations that sent shockwaves through the case. She claimed that some of the same men seen with George had sexually assaulted her earlier in the cruise. The attack had left her traumatized and afraid to speak up, but George's disappearance gave her the courage to come forward. Sarah's testimony was heartbreaking. She described how Josh and Travis had cornered her in a secluded area of the ship 2 nights before George's disappearance. She had been drinking, celebrating her high school graduation trip with friends, when the 2 men offered to show her a special view of the ocean from a restricted deck area. They said they knew secret places on the ship that regular passengers couldn't access, Sarah told Agent Martinez, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was naive. I thought they were just being friendly." The assault that followed was brutal and calculated. The men had clearly done this before, working together to isolate their victim and ensure she would be too ashamed and frightened to report the crime. They threatened her family back home, telling her that their father's lawyers would destroy her reputation if she ever spoke about what happened. Sarah's courage in coming forward provided crucial insight into the character of the men who had been with George on his final night. These weren't just wealthy young men having fun on vacation. They were predators who saw cruise ships as their hunting ground, places where they could commit crimes far from home with little fear of consequences. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle were starting to come together. The group of men, their history of violent and predatory behavior, the blood evidence in George's cabin, the callous video, and now a pattern of sexual assault. But despite all the circumstantial evidence, the FBI faced a crucial problem. Without George's body, without a clear witness to what happened on that balcony, building a murder case would be nearly impossible. Agent Martinez worked tirelessly over the following weeks, interviewing every passenger who had any contact with George or the group of men. She examined every piece of physical evidence, from the bloodstains to the video recordings. The blood was confirmed through DNA analysis to be George's, suggesting a violent struggle had taken place in the cabin. But the men in question had lawyers, families with money and influence who immediately descended upon the investigation. Travis Vader's father, a prominent businessman with political connections, hired a team of high-powered attorneys who immediately began working to discredit the investigation. They claimed that George had been drinking heavily throughout the evening and must have fallen overboard in a tragic accident. They suggested that the blood in the cabin could have come from a minor injury, perhaps a nosebleed or a small cut. "My client is devastated by this tragedy," said attorney Richard Sterling, speaking to reporters outside the FBI field office. "Travis considered George a friend, and he's cooperating fully with the investigation. Any suggestion that he or his companions had anything to do with Mr. Smith's disappearance is completely unfounded." But behind closed doors, the men were anything but cooperative. They hired separate attorneys, refused to take polygraph tests, and provided conflicting accounts of the evening's events. Josh claimed he had left the bar early and gone straight to bed. Ryan said he couldn't remember much of the evening due to drinking. Michael seemed nervous and kept changing his story about when he had last seen George. Travis, meanwhile, maintained his innocence with an arrogance that struck investigators as suspicious. He claimed that George had been acting strange during their final conversation, suggesting that the young man might have been having second thoughts about his marriage or dealing with personal problems that no one knew about. As weeks turned into months, the case began to stall. The media attention that had initially surrounded George's disappearance started to fade. The cruise line, Royal Caribbean, eager to protect their reputation and avoid negative publicity, pressured authorities to wrap up the investigation quickly. Company executives worried that prolonged media coverage of a murder aboard one of their ships would damage bookings and hurt their stock price. Internal memos later revealed that Royal Caribbean had considered offering the Smith family a substantial settlement in exchange for their silence about the case. The company's legal team argued that while they sympathized with the family's loss, the incident was not the result of any negligence on their part and that continued investigation was hurting their business. The men returned to their lives, seemingly unaffected by George's fate. Travis went back to his job at his father's investment firm. Josh enrolled in graduate school. Ryan took a position with a consulting company. Michael, who seemed most affected by the events, struggled with depression and began drinking heavily, but he never broke his silence about what really happened that night. But Jennifer refused to give up. Despite the overwhelming grief that threatened to consume her, she found strength in her determination to seek justice for George. She held press conferences in the lobby of the FBI building, offering rewards for information. She met with senators and congressmen, demanding that they pressure the FBI to keep the case active. "My husband was murdered," she said at one particularly emotional press conference, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I know it, you know it, and the men responsible know it. I will not let George's death be dismissed as an accident. I will not let his killers walk free. Jennifer's campaign kept George's story alive in the media. She appeared on television talk shows, gave interviews to newspapers and magazines, and created a website dedicated to finding the truth about her husband's death. The site featured photos of George, timeline of events from that night, and detailed information about the men who were with him when he disappeared. The website also became a gathering place for other families who had lost loved ones under suspicious circumstances while traveling. Jennifer discovered that George's case was not unique. There were dozens of similar incidents involving young people who had disappeared from cruise ships, often after drinking with groups of strangers. The years that followed were the darkest of Jennifer's life. She struggled with grief, with anger, with the terrible helplessness of knowing that somewhere out there, the people responsible for her husband's death were living free. She lit a memorial candle every night, a small ritual that kept George's memory burning bright in her heart. The candle sat on their dining room table, surrounded by photos of George from throughout his life. Baby pictures, graduation photos, wedding pictures, and the honeymoon photos from their first day on the cruise. Every night, Jennifer would light the candle and talk to George as if he were still there, telling him about her day, sharing her frustrations with the investigation, and promising that she would never give up fighting for him. George's parents, Maureen and George III, aged rapidly under the stress and heartbreak. The loss of their only son was devastating, but the lack of closure made their grief even more unbearable. Maureen would often call Jennifer in the middle of the night, sobbing and asking if there had been any new developments in the case. "I just need to know what happened to my boy," Maureen would say through her tears. "I need to know that the people who hurt him aren't out there hurting someone else's child." George's father threw himself into his work, unable to cope with the emotional reality of his son's death. He hired private investigators, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars pursuing leads that ultimately led nowhere. He established a foundation in George's name, offering college scholarships to young people from underprivileged backgrounds, trying to honor his son's memory through acts of generosity that George would have appreciated. Friends and family tried to encourage Jennifer to move on, to start dating again, to rebuild her life. They meant well, but they didn't understand that Jennifer couldn't move forward while George's killers walked free. She had made a promise to him on their honeymoon, a promise to love him forever, and she interpreted that to mean she would fight for him forever. "You need to think about your future," her sister Carol said during one particularly difficult conversation. "George wouldn't want you to spend your whole life consumed by this." "My future was with George," Jennifer replied. "Until his killers are brought to justice, I can't think about anything else." The investigation officially stalled in 2010, 5 years after George's disappearance. Agent Martinez, who had worked the case tirelessly, was promoted and transferred to another field office. Her replacement, Agent David Chen, reviewed the files but admitted that without new evidence, there was little the FBI could do. In 2015, 10 years after George's disappearance, the FBI officially closed the investigation. The letter Jennifer received was brief and bureaucratic, citing insufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges. The words on the page seemed to mock everything she had sacrificed, everything she had fought for. After extensive investigation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has determined that there is insufficient evidence to support criminal charges in the disappearance of George Smith IV. The letter read, "While we understand the family's desire for closure, we must base our decisions on facts and evidence that would be admissible in a court of law." Jennifer stared at the letter for hours, reading and rereading the cold, official language that seemed to dismiss her husband's life as a closed file. It felt like a slap in the face, a betrayal of everything George had meant to her and his family. "This can't be the end," Jennifer said to Agent Martinez, who had retired but maintained contact with the family over the years. "There has to be something more we can do." "I'm sorry, Jennifer," Martinez replied, her own frustration evident in her voice. "I know this isn't the outcome any of us wanted, but without new evidence, without a witness willing to come forward, our hands are tied." But Jennifer's determination had not wavered. If the FBI couldn't help her, she would find other ways to seek justice. She hired private investigators with experience in cold cases, spending her life savings and George's life insurance money on the pursuit of truth. She offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction in George's death. She created websites, social media pages, anything to keep George's case in the public eye. She traveled to conferences about unsolved crimes, networking with other families who had lost loved ones, and learning about new investigative techniques. She refused to let George's case fade into obscurity. Jennifer also began working with advocacy groups pushing for stronger safety regulations on cruise ships. She discovered that the maritime industry had successfully lobbied against many safety measures that could prevent crimes like the one that took George's life. Ships flew under foreign flags to avoid U.S. jurisdiction, making criminal investigations more complicated. Security cameras were often poorly positioned or malfunctioned conveniently when crimes occurred. The cruise industry has gotten away with treating their ships like lawless floating cities, Jennifer said at a congressional hearing on maritime safety. They put profits ahead of passenger safety, and when something terrible happens, they circle the wagons and wait for the media attention to die down. Her testimony was powerful and well-researched, drawing on not just George's case but dozens of similar incidents. She had become an expert on maritime law, jurisdictional issues, and the cruise industry's safety record. Her advocacy work gave her a sense of purpose during the darkest years of her grief. Then, in what seemed like divine intervention, an anonymous tip arrived in Jennifer's mailbox in the spring of 2018, a handwritten letter with no return address, postmarked from a small town in Pennsylvania. The writer claimed to have information about George's death, details that had never been made public, information that only someone who was present that night could know. "I know what happened to your husband," the letter began. "I've kept silent for too long, but I can't live with the guilt anymore. Travis Vader killed George Smith. I was there. I saw it happen. If you want to know the truth, place an ad in the Philadelphia Inquirer with the words, 'Truth for George,' and I'll contact you." Jennifer's hands shook as she read the letter. After 13 years of fighting, someone was finally ready to tell the truth. She immediately called Agent Martinez, who came out of retirement to help pursue this new lead. "This could be a hoax," Martinez warned. "We've had dozens of false tips over the years. People read about the case online and think they can get reward money by making up stories." "I know," Jennifer said, "but something about this feels different. The details they mention, the way it's written, I think this person was really there." Together, they placed the ad in the Philadelphia Inquirer and waited. 3 days later, Jennifer's cell phone rang from a blocked number. "Mrs. Smith," said a man's voice, nervous and strained. "I'm the one who wrote you the letter." The conversation that followed lasted over an hour. The caller identified himself as Michael Thompson, one of the men who had been with George that night. For 13 years, he had carried the burden of what he had witnessed, and the guilt had slowly destroyed his life. Michael described how the group had returned to Travis's cabin after the bar closed, continuing to drink and becoming increasingly aggressive and violent. George had become uncomfortable with their behavior, particularly their crude comments about female passengers and their plans to hunt for women to assault. "George told them they were sick," Michael said, his voice breaking. "He said he was going back to his wife, that he wanted nothing to do with what they were planning." That's when Travis snapped. The confrontation that followed was brutal. Travis, enraged that George was judging them, grabbed a bottle and hit George in the head. When George fought back, the other men joined in, beating him unconscious. Panicking and realizing what they had done, they carried George's body to his cabin, using his key card to get inside. "We thought maybe we could make it look like an accident," Michael continued, "like he had fallen and hit his head, but there was so much blood, and George wasn't waking up. Travis said we had to get rid of the body." The group carried George's unconscious form to the balcony and threw him overboard. Whether he was already dead or died when he hit the water, Michael didn't know. What he did know was that they had killed an innocent man whose only crime was standing up to their predatory behavior. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Jennifer asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I was terrified," Michael admitted. "Travis's family has money, power. He threatened all of us. Said if anyone talked, he'd make sure we went down too. But I can't live with this anymore. I see George's face every night when I close my eyes." Jennifer immediately contacted the FBI with this new information. Agent Chen, who had been skeptical about reopening the case, was convinced by the detailed and consistent nature of Michael's account. For the first time in years, there was real hope for justice. But building a case after 13 years would not be easy. Michael's testimony was crucial, but prosecutors knew that defense attorneys would argue he was an unreliable witness with his own motivations for lying. They needed corroborating evidence, something that would support his account of events. New technology had advanced significantly in the years since George's death. Enhanced forensic techniques allowed investigators to re-examine evidence with fresh eyes. Security footage from the ship that had been considered too grainy to be useful was now digitally enhanced using sophisticated computer algorithms. The enhanced footage revealed crucial details that had been missed in the original investigation. Cameras showed the group of men moving through the ship's corridors in the early morning hours, their body language and behavior consistent with Michael's account. One particularly damning piece of footage showed Travis disposing of something in a trash bin, FNEOC, the same location where the elderly witness had seen suspicious activity. Investigators also discovered that the group of men had a documented history of similar incidents on previous cruises. Working with international law enforcement, they uncovered police reports from ports in the Caribbean and Mediterranean where the men had been involved in assaults, harassment, and other violent behavior. In Barbados, Travis had been arrested for assault but was released when his family's lawyer arrived with a substantial cash payment to the victim. In Cozumel, Josh had been accused of sexual assault, but the charges were dropped when the victim's family was intimidated into silence. The pattern was clear. These men used their wealth and family connections to escape consequences for their actions. Most significantly, investigators discovered that there had been another suspicious death on a cruise ship involving members of this same group. 2 years before George's murder, a young woman named Lisa Rodriguez had disappeared overboard during a cruise where Travis and Josh were passengers. Her death had been ruled an accident, but now investigators began to see a pattern. The breakthrough that would make the case came when investigators found Travis's personal computer, which had been stored in his parents' basement since 2005. Advanced data recovery techniques revealed deleted files, including email conversations between the group members in the weeks following George's death. The emails were damning. In them, the men discussed keeping their stories straight and making sure the rich boy's family doesn't cause problems. Travis had written to Josh, "If that pussy, Michael, opens his mouth, we'll all go down. Keep him quiet, whatever it takes." Perhaps most shocking was an email Travis sent to his father, admitting that they had dealt with a problem on the cruise and might need legal help. His father's response was equally disturbing, promising to handle any complications and reminding his son that the family had resources to make difficulties disappear. With this new evidence, federal prosecutors felt confident enough to proceed with charges. In a carefully coordinated operation, FBI agents arrested Travis Vader at his Manhattan office on a Tuesday morning in September 2018. The arrest made national headlines, bringing George's case back into the public spotlight after more than a decade of silence. Josh, Ryan, and 2 other men who had been involved in the cover-up were arrested simultaneously in their respective cities. The coordinated arrests were designed to prevent the suspects from communicating with each other or disposing of evidence. The media coverage of the arrests was intense. News vans lined the street outside Travis's family home, reporters ambushed the suspects' attorneys as they left court, and George's story was told again on every major news network. After 13 years of silence, the world was finally paying attention to what had happened to George Smith IV. Jennifer felt a complex mix of emotions as she watched the news coverage. Relief that the case was finally moving forward, anger that it had taken so long, and a deep sadness that George wasn't there to see justice finally beginning to unfold. She appeared on television news programs, her dignity and strength evident as she spoke about her long fight for truth. "This isn't about revenge," Jennifer said in one interview. "It's about justice. It's about making sure that people who commit violent crimes don't get to walk away just because they have money and family connections. George deserves justice, and so do all the other victims of these men." The trial that followed was everything Jennifer had hoped for and feared. She sat in the courtroom every day, often accompanied by George's parents, watching as prosecutors methodically built their case. The evidence was overwhelming. Michael's testimony, the enhanced video footage, the deleted emails, the pattern of violent behavior, and the forensic evidence from the cabin. Travis Vader's defense team, led by celebrity attorney Marcus Williams, attempted to discredit the case by attacking Michael's credibility. They painted him as a desperate man seeking revenge against his former friends, someone who had fabricated his story to deflect blame from his own actions that night. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Williams said in his opening statement, "you are being asked to convict my client based on the word of a man who admits he was present when someone allegedly died and did nothing to stop it. Michael Thompson is not a hero coming forward to tell the truth. He's a coward trying to save himself." The defense argued that George's death was a tragic accident, that the young man had been drinking heavily and fell overboard while the other men were sleeping. They claimed that the blood in the cabin came from a minor injury, perhaps a nosebleed caused by the sea air and alcohol consumption. But the prosecution had a powerful case. They presented the enhanced video footage showing the coordinated movement of the suspects through the ship. They detailed the pattern of violence and sexual assault that characterized the group's behavior on previous cruises. They presented the deleted emails showing the conspiracy to cover up the crime. Most damaging was Michael's testimony. Over 3 days on the witness stand, he provided a detailed, consistent account of what had happened that night. His obvious remorse and emotional distress as he described the events convinced many observers of his truthfulness. "We were drunk and angry," Michael said, tears streaming down his face. "George was trying to be the voice of reason, trying to get us to stop talking about hurting people. Travis saw that as a challenge to his authority, to his control over the group." Michael described how Travis had become increasingly violent over the years, how he used his family's wealth and connections to escape consequences for his actions. "He thought he was untouchable," Michael testified. "He thought money could fix any problem, even murder." The defense's cross-examination of Michael was brutal. Williams spent hours trying to poke holes in his story, to find inconsistencies that would undermine his credibility. But Michael's account remained consistent, his details matching the physical evidence and other witness testimony. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when prosecutors played portions of the video the men had recorded making fun of George's disappearance. The courtroom was silent as Travis's voice filled the room, joking about George's death just hours after it had occurred. Jennifer watched the jury's faces as they heard Travis laughing about her husband's murder. She saw the disgust, the horror, the understanding that this was not the behavior of innocent men, shocked by a tragic accident. The trial also featured testimony from Sarah Collins, now in her 30s and a successful attorney herself. She courageously described her assault by Travis and Josh, providing crucial context about the violent and predatory nature of the group's behavior. "They told me that no one would believe me," Sarah testified. "They said their families had more money than I could imagine, and they would destroy my reputation if I ever spoke about what they did to me." Her testimony was particularly powerful because it showed that the assault on George was not an isolated incident of violence. It was part of a pattern of predatory behavior that had been going on for years, enabled by wealth and family connections that had previously protected the perpetrators from consequences. As the trial progressed, additional victims came forward, women who had been assaulted or harassed by members of the group on various cruises over the years, men who had been beaten or threatened for standing up to their behavior. A picture emerged of a group of predators who had been using cruise ships as their hunting ground for nearly a decade. The prosecution also called Jennifer to testify about George's character and their relationship. Her testimony was heartbreaking as she described the man she had fallen in love with, his kindness and generosity, his dreams for their future together. "George would give the shirt off his back to a stranger," Jennifer said, looking directly at Travis as she spoke. "He trusted everyone he met. That was his weakness, but it was also what made him beautiful. These men took advantage of his kindness and murdered him for it." Defense witnesses included character witnesses for Travis, people who described him as a successful businessman and devoted son, but their testimony rang hollow against the overwhelming evidence of his violent behavior and the callous way he had joked about George's death. The trial lasted 6 weeks. During closing arguments, prosecutor Amanda Richardson summarized the case against Travis with devastating effectiveness. She walked the jury through the evidence step by step, from the group's history of violence to the brutal assault on George to the calculated cover-up that followed. "This was not a spontaneous act of violence," Richardson told the jury. "This was the culmination of years of predatory behavior by men who believed they were above the law. They killed George Smith because he dared to stand up to them, because he threatened their sense of entitlement and superiority." Defense attorney Williams made one final attempt to save his client, arguing that the prosecution's case was built on the testimony of a confessed accomplice and circumstantial evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "the burden of proof in this case is beyond a reasonable doubt. Has the prosecution met that burden, or are you being asked to convict based on emotion and speculation?" The jury deliberated for 3 days. Jennifer barely slept during that time, consumed by the fear that even now, after all the evidence and all the years of fighting, justice might slip away. She paced the halls of the courthouse, surrounded by family and friends who had supported her throughout the long ordeal. On the 3rd day, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed as the foreman stood to read the decision. Jennifer held her breath. George's parents gripped each other's hands, and the entire courtroom fell silent. On the charge of murder in the first degree, "We find the defendant Travis Vader guilty." The words hit Jennifer like a physical force. Years of grief, rage, and determination finally found release in tears of relief and vindication. George's parents collapsed into each other's arms, their long nightmare finally coming to an end. Travis showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but his parents sobbed openly in the gallery. The man who had joked about George's death, who had spent 13 years believing he would never face consequences for his actions, was finally held accountable. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. Jennifer was allowed to give a victim impact statement, her first opportunity to speak directly to the man who had murdered her husband. "You took everything from me, she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "You didn't just kill George. You killed our future, our dreams, our family. You robbed his parents of their only son. You destroyed countless lives because you couldn't stand being challenged by a good man." She paused, looking directly at Travis, who still refused to meet her eyes. "But you didn't win. Despite your money, despite your family's connections, despite 13 years of lies and cover-ups, the truth finally came out." George's voice was finally heard. Judge Margaret Sullivan sentenced Travis to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years for their roles in the murder and cover-up. "This was a senseless act of violence that robbed a young man of his life and a family of their beloved son and husband," Judge Sullivan said. "The defendants' actions in the aftermath, the cover-up, the lies, the attempts to use wealth and privilege to escape justice, and ECR equally reprehensible. But even with justice served, the scars remained deep and painful." Jennifer found herself struggling with a complex mix of emotions in the aftermath of the trial. She had achieved what she had fought for during 13 long years, but the victory felt hollow and incomplete. George was still gone. The years of pain and struggle couldn't be erased by a verdict. The trial's conclusion sent ripples throughout the community and beyond. People who had known George came forward to share their memories, their own grief at his loss, and their admiration for Jennifer's tireless fight for justice. Letters poured in from around the world, from people who had followed the case and been inspired by her determination. A memorial service was held at George's home church in Greenwich, attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched during his brief 26 years. Friends from high school and college shared stories of his kindness and generosity. Co-workers described his professionalism and integrity. Family members spoke of a young man who had brought joy and laughter into their lives. "George lived more fully in 26 years than most people do in a lifetime," his father said during the service. "He loved deeply, gave generously, and treated everyone he met with respect and kindness. That's the legacy he leaves behind." Jennifer began the slow and difficult process of healing. She started seeing a therapist, working through the trauma of losing George and the stress of fighting for justice for over a decade. The sessions were painful, forcing her to confront emotions she had suppressed during her single-minded pursuit of the truth. Dr. Patricia Reeves, a specialist in grief counseling, helped Jennifer understand that her long fight for justice had been a form of survival mechanism, a way of avoiding the full reality of her loss. "You couldn't afford to completely grieve George while his killers were still free," Dr. Reeves explained. "Now that justice has been served, you have to learn how to live with that grief in a healthy way." The process was agonizing. For 13 years, Jennifer's entire identity had been built around seeking justice for George. Now that the trial was over, she had to figure out who she was without that mission driving her forward. She experienced what therapists call survivor's guilt, wondering why she deserved to move forward with her life when George couldn't. Gradually, with professional help and the support of family and friends, Jennifer found the strength to begin moving forward. She established the George Smith Foundation, dedicated to helping families of victims who had died under suspicious circumstances while traveling. The foundation provided resources, legal assistance, and emotional support to people facing the same nightmare Jennifer had endured. "George always wanted to help people," Jennifer said at the foundation's launch ceremony. "He had such a generous spirit, always looking for ways to make other people's lives better. This foundation is how we keep that spirit alive, how we make sure his death serves a purpose." The foundation's first case involved a young woman who had disappeared from a cruise ship in the Caribbean. Her family had been told it was suicide, but they suspected foul play. Using lessons learned from George's case, the foundation helped them hire qualified investigators and navigate the complex jurisdictional issues involved in maritime crimes. Within 3 years, the foundation had helped dozens of families seek answers about suspicious deaths and disappearances. Jennifer traveled around the country, speaking at conferences and meetings, sharing her expertise, and offering support to people facing similar tragedies. The work was emotionally demanding but also healing. Jennifer found purpose in helping others, and she began to feel that George's death, while senseless and tragic, had led to something meaningful. Other families were getting answers, other killers were being brought to justice, partly because of the precedent set by George's case. Years passed, and Jennifer slowly began to reclaim her life. She moved to a new house, unable to bear living in the home she and George had shared. She started dating again, though it took a long time to open her heart to someone new. She made new friends and reconnected with old ones who had been patient during her years of single-minded focus on the case. She also maintained relationships with people who had been part of George's case. Agent Martinez became a close friend, someone who understood the toll the investigation had taken. Michael Thompson, the witness whose testimony had been crucial to the conviction, stayed in touch, their shared experience creating an unlikely bond. Michael had struggled with addiction and depression in the years following George's death, but testifying at the trial had been cathartic for him. "I finally told the truth," he said to Jennifer after the verdict. "For the first time in 13 years, I can sleep at night." Jennifer found herself able to think about George without the crushing weight of anger and frustration that had consumed her for so long. She remembered their honeymoon's first day, his excitement about their future, the way he made everyone around him feel special and valued. These memories, once too painful to bear, became sources of comfort and strength. One evening, while going through boxes in her new home's attic, Jennifer discovered George's personal journal. She had forgotten about it, packed away years earlier when the pain was too fresh to handle reading his private thoughts. Now feeling ready to connect with him in this intimate way, she opened the leather-bound book with trembling hands. The pages were filled with his hopes and dreams, his love for Jennifer, his excitement about starting a family and building a life together. His handwriting, so familiar and dear, brought him closer to her than he had felt since that terrible morning when she woke to find him gone. "I can't wait to grow old with Jennifer." One entry read, dated just a month before their wedding, "I want to be the kind of husband she deserves, the kind of father our children will be proud of. I have so many plans, so much I want to accomplish. Life is good, and it's only going to get better." Another entry, written during their engagement, revealed his deep love and commitment. "Jennifer makes me want to be a better man. She sees something in me that I'm still learning to see in myself. I promise I'll spend every day of our marriage trying to deserve her love." The words broke Jennifer's heart and healed it simultaneously. George had been taken from them at the height of his happiness, full of love and dreams for the future. But his impact on the world lived on through everyone who remembered him, through the foundation that bore his name, and through the justice that had finally been served. Jennifer also found entries where George wrote about his philosophy of life, his belief in treating everyone with kindness and respect, regardless of their circumstances. "I think the measure of a man isn't what he accomplishes," he had written, "but how he treats people who can't do anything for him. I want to be remembered as someone who made other people's lives a little bit better." Reading these words, Jennifer realized that George's legacy was already secure. He had made everyone around him feel valued and loved. He had died standing up for what was right, refusing to tolerate the predatory behavior of men who abused their privilege and power. His death had led to a foundation that was helping other families find justice and closure. On the 20th anniversary of George's death, Jennifer stood on a cliff overlooking the ocean near their hometown of Greenwich. It was the same ocean where George had disappeared, though thousands of miles from where his life had ended. She carried a small bouquet of white roses, his favorite flowers. The wind whipped her hair around her face as she spoke to him one final time, sharing everything that had happened since his death, all the ways his memory had continued to impact the world. "I kept my promise, George," she whispered to the waves below. "I never stopped fighting for you. I never gave up. And now, finally, I can let you rest in peace." She told him about the trial, about Travis's conviction, about the foundation that was helping other families. She shared her guilt about moving forward with her life, and her hope that he would understand and approve. "I'm going to try to be happy again," she said, tears mixing with the salt spray from the ocean. "I'm going to try to live the kind of life you would want me to live. But I'll never forget you, and I'll never stop missing you." She scattered the rose petals into the wind, watching them dance across the water before disappearing into the vast blue expanse. For the first time in 20 years, Jennifer felt truly at peace. George was gone, but he was not forgotten. Justice had been served. Truth had prevailed. As she walked away from the cliff, Jennifer felt George's presence one last time, not the desperate, grief-stricken longing that had characterized her feelings for so many years, but a warm, peaceful sense of his love and approval. She smiled through her tears, knowing that while their earthly journey together had been cut tragically short, their love would endure forever. The sun set behind her as she drove home, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Jennifer Smith drove toward her future, forever changed by loss but strengthened by love, carrying George's memory in her heart as she continued the adventure of living, not just for herself, but for both of them. Years later, when people asked her how she had found the strength to fight for so long, Jennifer would think back to that promise George had asked her to make on their honeymoon, the promise to always remember that perfect moment of love and possibility. She had kept that promise, and in doing so, she had honored not just George's memory, but the love that would forever connect them across the divide between life and death. The Connecticut cold case that had haunted so many people for so long was finally closed. But the impact of George Smith IV's murder and Jennifer's relentless pursuit of justice would continue to resonate for years to come. The case had changed maritime law enforcement, leading to stricter regulations for cruise ships and better protocols for investigating crimes at sea. The Smith family's advocacy had helped pass legislation requiring better security measures on cruise ships and improve cooperation between international law enforcement agencies. More importantly, George's story had inspired countless other families to never give up hope, to keep fighting for their loved ones even when the odds seemed impossible. The George Smith Foundation continued to grow, helping families around the world seek justice for suspicious deaths and disappearances during travel. Jennifer eventually remarried, finding love again with a man who understood and respected her journey. They had children together, and Jennifer would tell them stories about Uncle George, keeping his memory alive for a new generation. She would describe his kindness, his laughter, his dreams, ensuring that his legacy would continue long after everyone who knew him personally was gone. Travis Vader died in prison in 2035, 30 years old and still refusing to accept responsibility for his crimes. His death was unremarkable, a footnote in a story that had been defined by much larger themes of justice, persistence, and the power of love to overcome even the darkest evil. The other members of the group served their sentences and were eventually released, but their lives were forever marked by their participation in George's murder. Some found redemption through genuine remorse and efforts to make amends. Others, like Josh, remained unrepentant and bitter, blaming their downfall on Michael's betrayal rather than their own actions. Michael Thompson became a powerful advocate for victims' rights, speaking at conferences and working with law enforcement to help solve other cold cases. His courage in coming forward had not only brought George's killers to justice, but it also helped convict other predators who had been protected by wealth and privilege. On quiet evenings, when the wind was just right, Jennifer would sometimes think she could hear George's laughter carried on the breeze. She would remember that first perfect day of their honeymoon, the promise they had made to each other, and the love that had sustained her through the darkest years of her life. The balcony railing where George was last seen alive became a symbol of hope rather than tragedy, representing the moment when truth finally conquered lies, when justice finally defeated corruption, when love finally triumphed over hate. George Smith IV had lived only 26 years, but his impact on the world would last forever. His death had exposed a network of predators and led to their conviction. His memory had inspired legislation that would protect future travelers. His love had given Jennifer the strength to change the world. In the end, that was perhaps the most fitting tribute to a young man who had always believed in treating everyone with kindness and respect, who had died defending those values, and whose legacy would continue to protect others for generations to come. The disturbing evidence and unanswered questions that had persisted for so long were finally resolved. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and George Smith IV could finally rest in peace, knowing that his death had not been in vain and that the love he had shared with Jennifer would echo through eternity.